Thank you all for staying with us till the end. Thanks for being here. I'm so happy to see so many of you here. It's the last session. We're all exhausted after 3 days of really intense and interesting discussions. So I hope we can make this fun, invigorating, inspiring. Let's see. This session is about business, biodiversity, and nature-based solutions. And we're delighted to welcome some businesses and NGOs today. We have David Croft from Reckitt. Our colleague Pedro Moura Costa unfortunately could not join us. We've had a few changes to the program. Pedro couldn't join us, but he sent us a statement that I will read out for you. William also couldn't join us, but he sent us a video. We have Niki Mardas from Global Canopy program. Stephanie Paquin-Jaloux, who is joining us online, representing Firmenich, and Keyvan Macedo, who is here representing Natura & Co. We also have a surprise guest visit from Alexia, who is representing Netflix. So we'll go through that. But just a little bit of an introduction to start. Delivering economic stability whilst bending the curve on biodiversity loss, achieving sustainable development goals, keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees are the greatest challenges and opportunities of our century. We've been discussing this extensively over the past 3 days. And as has been said again and again, governments, financial institutions, businesses are increasingly recognizing this. And this afternoon, we're here to explore the role of the private sector in addressing these challenges. So over the past couple of years, a number of global announcements, a number of announcements have been made that affect businesses. For example, in 2021, the G7 backed the introduction of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. So from 2023, Andy will help us decipher this later, but from 2023, companies will need to disclose their nature-related impacts and dependencies, along with the climate-related risks they have been reporting since 2015 under the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. The TNFD on nature, the TCFD on climate, both frameworks were established to provide risk management and disclosure frameworks for organizations to report and act on climate and biodiversity loss. These initiatives are regulated by the International Sustainable Standards Board, which was established, which was launched at COP26. This is, oh, you can't see it. Sorry, this is what I meant to show. This is a mural we painted during COP26 to capture the main messages that came out of the event, of the negotiations. Well, of the negotiations in the center and of what happened around the negotiations around the center of the illustration. So also at COP26, as you can see on here, we saw a flurry of announcements around the core business of the negotiations of the Paris Rulebook, mainly focused on eliminating commodity-driven deforestation and shifting to more sustainable farming practices. So there are lots of them you can see here. There's the Glasgow Leaders Forest Declaration, the Global Forest Finance Pledge, the LEAF Coalition, the Agriculture and Commodity Trade Statement, etc. And all in all, these commitments from private and public sector amounted to 19 billion for nature. We've mentioned this. A good start, but far from the 700 billion funding gap that was mentioned by Ben Caldecott yesterday in the finance section. And I'm sure Niki will put this in perspective later on when he talks about the 7 trillion that comes from financial institutions still going towards deforestation. So all these commitments are great, they're great starts, but now we need to provide the mechanisms to ensure accountability, transparency, and how will these commitments be implemented, monitored, and regulated in a socially just context. So it's been the saying at COP26 was, we need a just transition, not just a transition. So still, all this demonstrates that the private sector are increasingly engaged, which is important given the need for private sector financing to get to our climate and biodiversity goals. Yet, as ambitious net zero targets are being announced, companies are increasingly relying on nature-based solutions to offset their emissions. And this is where I wanted to remind you about this division. Is it coming? Okay. So Stephanie Rowe talked about the potential for nature-based solutions to mitigate climate change in her talk, and she mentioned a potential of 11 gigatons CO2 per year mitigation. That was including all green, so CO2 equivalent, all greenhouse gases. Here we're only looking at CO2, and when we only look at CO2, we get to about 10 gigatons CO2 per year mitigation potential. But what's interesting here is that once we divide this into the different pathways of nature-based solutions, we get about 40% coming from, protecting existing ecosystems, and that's from avoided emissions, so from avoided degradation of land or avoided degradation of ecosystems, stopping deforestation. Another 40% coming from the better management of agricultural lands, so better management of existing lands. These are lands we're already using for agriculture, and measures like better soil management that were mentioned by Pete Smith in session 2, and agroforestry and other better management that have been extensively covered over the past 2 days. And only 20% comes from restoring ecosystems. So that 20% is carbon sink, enhancement of carbon sink. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about reaching our net zero goals and about offsetting. And the contribution of that 20% would come from restoring all ecosystems around about twice the size of India. So we need a lot of land to achieve this, and we would need to achieve this fast. And in terms that are relevant to the Paris Agreement, when we plug these values into the IPCC models, we can see that it would lead we could see that the benefits of nature-based solutions to reduce global warming is time sensitive. In the short term, when we reach a peak of 1.5 degrees by mid-century, we would get benefits of about 0.1 degrees less by implementing nature-based solutions at scale, starting now immediately. In the longer term, once we get to 2 degrees scenario, where we peak later in 2080, we get up to a 0.3 degrees reduction in temperature on the global scale. But what's interesting here is that nature-based solutions continue acting up to the end of the century, and they have an important role to play in cooling global warming after we reach peak warming. So it highlights again, as we've been saying over the past 3 days a lot, but this highlights the importance of investing in projects that have longevity, in projects that are ecologically sound, ecologically robust, and that are also implemented in the right social context and will continue working for the long term. That's my piece. Nature-based solutions have multiple benefits, and we've heard that over the past 3 days a lot. We saw that they provide much, much more than climate mitigation benefit. I won't go over everything that has been said, but all in all, we've been covering all this. But economic studies are increasingly demonstrating that climate change and biodiversity loss bring operational risk, liability, regulatory, financial risks, and that natural capital is the most important input to the global economy. They show clearly that investing in the protection, restoration, and better management of biodiversity makes economic sense. So with all this in mind, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to discuss, to explore how businesses can embed biodiversity, climate, and human well-being in the core of their operations. And I think we are starting with a video, with a talk, a brief talk from Alexia, who is representing Netflix. Alexia Kelly, who is the Director of Net Zero and Nature at Netflix.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to the organizers and for the invitation to participate in this conference. I'm very sorry I'm not there in person. It sounds like it's been a fascinating few days. As was mentioned, I'm Alexia Kelly. I'm the Director of Net Zero plus Nature at Netflix, where I oversee all of the implementation work related to our science-based target internally, as well as our carbon credit portfolio. So I'm delighted to be here to speak with you briefly about some of the work that we're doing in this space. As I think many of you know, Netflix is a relative newcomer to the sustainability space. We formally established the sustainability program in October of 2020, but are working to make up for our tardy entry with what we hope is speed and ambition. In March of 2021, just last year, we announced our climate program goals under the Net Zero plus Nature umbrella, which includes a science-based targets initiative validated science-based target of 45% absolute reductions below 2019 levels across scopes 1 and 2 by 2030, and our Net Zero plus Nature target by the end of this year, which I'll say more about in just a few minutes. I'm pleased to say that 18 months into our program, we are on track to deliver on our science-based target and have implemented a wide range of internal emission reduction projects and initiatives to rapidly reduce our own internal emissions. These efforts last year delivered about 14,000 metric tons of avoided emissions. And we did this by working with our local utilities, our landlords, our streaming partners to switch to renewable electricity. We swapped in diesel generator in our productions. We've been trialing electric vehicles. We've been looking at opportunities to replace noisy and polluting diesel generators with mobile batteries and hydrogen power units, and we're buying sustainable aviation fuel. We're working diligently to rapidly reduce our own emissions and transform an industry that has really relied on fossil fuels for its entire history. But this transition will take effort, it takes investment, and it takes time. And this is where voluntary carbon markets come into play. We see voluntary carbon markets as offering a really important opportunity for us to invest in climate change mitigation and biodiversity conservation and preservation outside of our value chain in a really meaningful way now. So we have made an ambitious commitment as a company to achieve net zero emissions across all 3 scopes by 2022. And we're doing this under what we call a yes and approach to climate action, which firmly grounds us in what the science is telling us we must do to avert the most catastrophic impacts of climate change, which is, of course, to reduce our internal emissions as much as possible on an annual basis, and then fully mitigate our footprint through investment in high quality carbon removal and retention projects. As the latest IPCC science shows, emissions cuts today are equally, if not more valuable than emissions reductions that occur 5 or 10 years in the future. Even if society is able to draw down emissions after surpassing 1.5 degrees, which unfortunately we are very rapidly headed for, a lot of these impacts after surpassing that temperature threshold become irreversible. So by restoring degraded ecosystems and effectively and equitably conserving 30 to 50% of the Earth's land, freshwater, and ocean habitats, society can benefit from nature's capacity to absorb and store carbon, and we can accelerate progress towards sustainable development through adequate financing and political support. So this science is really what has driven our investment in nature. And the way that we've chosen to do this is through investment in high quality carbon credit projects that prevent carbon from entering the atmosphere, called carbon sinks, and through projects that remove carbon through the atmosphere by regenerating natural ecosystems. Over time, we'll increasingly focus on removals, but as many folks have noted, protecting those irrecoverable carbon stocks today is essential to delivering on our climate change goals. In addition to nature-based solutions, we're also focusing on integrating methane mitigation as a key opportunity to help us buy time and ensure that we are accelerating the investment seamlessly into the new low carbon economy. So last year, we screened more than 150 million tons of carbon credit projects, and we selected a high-quality portfolio of 17 nature-based projects that restore mangroves, improve forest management practices, increase soil carbon sequestration, and protect and preserve those irrecoverable carbon stocks in both tropical and temperate forests. These 17 projects delivered more than 1.5 million metric tons of mitigation and provided much needed financing directly to the communities where they originated. More than 70% of them were also certified under the Climate Change Community and Biodiversity Standard. And we implemented extensive additional screens for gender and local benefit sharing arrangements, robust governance procedures, biodiversity impacts. So these projects we see as a really important opportunity to mobilize climate finance directly to frontline communities and to really make sure that we are providing these communities with the resources that they need, in addition to providing really important climate resilience and adaptation benefits. These additional benefits, these co-benefits, are often not quantified, but deliver substantial benefits to the communities that are at the front lines of responding to this challenge. Carbon markets, while not perfect, help direct investment to where the societal return on investment is the highest on the right timelines, which is now. And they're a way for us to voluntarily contribute to the climate fight by going above and beyond our internal reduction commitments or our fair share of effort as we seek to decarbonize the entire global economy in the next 15 to 20 years. We believe that carbon credits should be included and clearly incentivized in the net zero transition and the emerging taxonomies that are evolving around that, and believe that they can play a central role in increasing corporate climate ambition in the near term, while mobilizing desperately needed climate finance for frontline communities and ecosystem protection. So thank you very much for the invitation to join you today, and I look forward to the discussion and questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Alexia. Hope you can stay for the discussion. I was wondering, so we'll keep questions for later and we'll have a discussion. I think we'll have a rich discussion around carbon offsets and the role of carbon offsets in achieving net zero. And I would like to introduce now David, who is the Global Director of Sustainability, Environment and Human Rights for Reckitt. So David, as you're preparing to announce Reckitt's biodiversity targets, I'm wondering if you can give us some insights on the challenges you faced for that.
Afternoon, everybody. So I'm David Croft. I look after sustainability for Reckitt. You probably haven't heard of Reckitt. Hopefully you've heard of some of our brands, so it's brands like Finish or Durex, and I'm going to talk a bit more about latex, which seems a weird thing to perhaps be talking about. But let me just give you some background to how we got to where we are. I was intrigued when listening to Cécile a moment ago. The private sector is absolutely getting more and more involved and thinking a lot more about nature-based solutions and activity dependent upon it. And the rationale for that also spins back to what Cécile was talking about in terms of the proportions of opportunity from managed and restored and so on. Because I think you said 40% come from managed landscapes, most of which will have a significant chunk that is part of a global value chain that various businesses, particularly food and ag, are involved in. Now, Reckitt isn't particularly a food and ag business, but trust me, if we don't have rubber trees, then we don't have condoms, and the rest sort of is history, as you say. And that's partly how we got into much more of this conversation. As a non-food business, why does nature-based solutions matter? Well, it matters because even in our sector, there is a very strong connection to landscapes and ecosystems where some of those, relatively few in proportion, but some of those very important materials come from. What we also see is the interconnectivity between the climate conversation and ecosystems and biodiversity conversation, and also a community and social and fairness conversation, all of which play to exactly what we're framing our non-financial agenda about. And our sustainability ambitions that I'm responsible for cover that obvious aspects of people, planet and product, but it's very much playing those in balance, because it's too easy, I think, to see these things in silos. And the risk is if you start to see them in silos, then any solutions are also somewhat silo-driven. And that has the risk of unintended consequences. It has certainly the risk of unsustainable solutions, but it also has the risk of missed opportunities. And most of the time, when the private sector starts to think about these things, whether it's TNFD or TCFD, the operative word within that is risk. How do you manage risk? Risk at a range of different levels, but increasingly, as you heard yesterday, risk that is driven by an investor conversation. But if you manage only risk, then to be honest, it's pretty boring. If you start to think about how you flip to the other side of that same coin, and you start to create opportunity, medium and long-term opportunity, then it's much more motivating. And to put it really bluntly, you can get a lot more funding for it. And what we've been starting to do a lot more in Reckitt is think in this transition from what was a compliance conversation into much more about how do you drive long-term resilience, long-term opportunity throughout our value chain for the communities, the suppliers, the consumers involved, that also inevitably brings long-term value for our business. Because what I also see from the investors when I speak to them, and I speak to them on a very regular basis, is that they are looking for this balance of risk, but also opportunity development. And that's what has been much more motivating in Reckitt in the last 2 or 3 years since I joined. First of all, this understanding of the complexity of the total ecosystem that business, that we're all part of, but business especially has a significant role to play. And secondly, that as you start to think about how you're going to mitigate risk, you also create opportunities for driving different activities going forward that either make or support better resilience or create new opportunities, different opportunities for the future. And that's where we sort of netted in some of this conversation, that as we start to look in much more detail about that transition from a compliance and a protection of ecosystems, which has been part and parcel of activity for a number of years, into how do you think much more about regenerating and the value that you then create for everybody involved in that landscape, as well as our business that is part of it, then you change how you approach all of this work. And that led us, about 15 months or so ago, to the start of conversations with Cécile and Nathalie and the team here in Oxford about nature-based solutions. And I wanted to share a little bit more about how we have been developing that. If I can work the clicker. Oh no. There we go. Children, animals and IT. This is the broad framework that with the team here we've developed. And it talks to pretty much what you'd expect in terms of biodiversity, climate and sustainable development, social impact indicators, because we recognised at the outset, and frankly not just at the outset in this work, but also in work that I've done in the past, that if you don't bring that, as I was hearing yesterday and the day before particularly, the cultural connection, the community connection, the people-centric connection to the heart of what you're trying to do, then the reality is any change that comes will probably not be sustainable, not be embedded, and actually not embraced. And so, irrespective of the social impacts you're able to create, if you're thinking about, and certainly as we are, in the work that we're doing, thinking about it means we want to drive that social connection. Years ago, I did some work with cocoa farmers in West Africa, and I worked with the UNDP on this. We were working with hundreds of thousands of small farmers in Africa, and we started off a conversation by saying, we want to think about socioeconomic discussions. We want to help them with productivity. There was a real challenge about real social issues of child labouring. UNDP at the time said, we can't go any further unless you immediately put something in about the environment. What we learned from those communities was, with the best one in the world, they weren't interested about the environment on day one, because what they were bothered about was putting food on their families' tables and sending their kids to school. 12 months later, when we'd helped improve productivity against the plan that they defined as a community, a plan that was developed with the elders, with the men, with the women, with the young people in the community, we were in a position then to talk about what you would now describe perhaps as a nature-based solution. that started to lead to the opportunities for carbon sequestration within the way they were farming, a biodiversity metric, because we were able to measure that in some work that we were doing, that could ultimately lead to ecosystem services payments. And that's fundamentally at the heart of the model that we're now trying to drive in Reckitt about latex farming. Latex farmers in southern Thailand, which is the first hotbed area that we're looking at, that we began with some of these qualitative review processes, that you start to see. It's moved on here, but it's not moved on there. Very disconcerting. Let me try again. Trust me, this slide is really good. You'll like this one when it comes up. If it goes to the one after it, tell me. You see here the sort of timeline, and we've been working through how we now go from the qualitative view of key value chains, latex being the first one we're really targeting, but we're also looking at palm, and we're also looking at key fragrances. And fragrances you don't buy in big volumes, but they are perhaps significant in the landscapes that they're part of. We're then mining that further into a more quant review of what is happening on the ground. And that drives, importantly, towards metrics. And I'll talk a bit more about metrics in a moment. And then over the rest of this decade, you start to develop interventions using those same metrics, thinking about how we work with the farming communities, how we help with agronomy support, and how we build additional interventions that we can balance in terms of the metrics we've got and try and resource the ones that will have greatest impact across the climate, biodiversity, and social indicators. Now that's particularly difficult because we heard from Pam McElwee on Tuesday morning. There are going to be trade-offs, but having a bigger framework, and let me take you into some more of that framework conversation, helps us to sort of understand how, there we go, I've worked the system out now, helps us build those metrics at a greater level of detail so we are better able to understand some of the trade-offs that are going to get made. And this starts to give you a sense of the overarching framework that drives towards this cumulative biodiversity impact metric that also has a climate conversation and is in the stages of having a social conversation being built around it. Because as I said before, if we do not engage with those farmers and those communities and their cultural value set and their inherent history with the land, then it will not last. It will not work. And that's not good for them, and it's certainly not good for us, and it's certainly not good for the ecosystem they're part of. But knowing those social dynamics also allows us to think very carefully about how do you then start to think about interventions that add greater value. And I think that's where ecosystem services, in a range of different ways, start to become part of this conversation going forward. And that's why the private sector activity is quite important, because you start to be able to develop a market dynamic that adds scale to drive impact. And I think if we're going to think about longevity of these initiatives and scale, then thinking about how different actors, market actors and non-market actors are involved becomes quite important. And that's not to say that either on their own is adequate. Let me give you the detail. Now, please don't, Cécile told me I've got to say this very, very clearly. The numbers that are on here, these are slides that we developed as part of a workshop back in January. The numbers have been superseded. Do not quote the numbers. They have gone further. That is much better. So if you quote the picture, that's great, but please don't quote the numbers because she'll shout at me afterwards. But joking aside, it tells you that this is a very dynamic process. We are continuing to build with the team here based on increasingly stronger data on the ground, more understanding of what those different issues are, where the benefits are, where the impacts are, and how you start to think through those different trade-offs. And what that then leads you to is some thoughts about the type of intervention and the breadth of impacts that you have, that you then have to sort of think through in terms of the activity you take forward. And then just to close, because I'm running out of time, and we can pick some of this up on questions, I'm sure. What is critical, I think, driven by perhaps a very polarized conversation from investors talking about TNFD, or other people talking about something else, or business talking about sustainable supply chain, is that unless you have more robust metrics, your ability to manage and consider trade-offs gets harder and harder. Your ability to consider the different types of interventions is limited if you don't have good metrics. But at the same time, I also think we cannot wait for the best possible set of metrics because we haven't got the time to wait. And so our aim with the work that we're doing now, and that will continue to build the model over the next few years as we take it into life in more detail on the ground with latex farmers, is to think, are we in the right tram lines that we will progressively narrow? But continuing to build metrics is a critical part of that. The second point I'd leave you with is no one sector, no one actor is going to do this effectively on their own. The last 20-odd years or so of the development agenda is littered with examples of multi-stakeholder partnerships that never got to scale. This whole element of nature-based solutions, for me, is another example of where multi-sector activity, public sector actors, private sector actors, civil society, with overarching policy frameworks to facilitate and drive and hold people to account is critical. But it is critical we also get it to scale, and we get it to scale quickly. And it's important that we see those actors working in concert. I think we have to blend market-based and non-market-based actors much more effectively. I, with another hat on, sit around the OECD Development Committee table. And what I hear there is everybody pointing towards the same issues to try and solve those same issues. But that means there's a whole host of other things that never get talked about or never get any action. Now, I'm not saying that you should do them separately in silos. What I'm saying is you should do them visibly and transparently with thoughtful metrics, considered impact and interventions, and actually transparent reporting that drives performance and also drives accountability within an overarching policy framework. Because if you frame it that way, I think you can blend market-based actors, which, let's be honest, have not always worked in the world's best interest, with non-market actors to try and create the best opportunity we have to create solutions at scale and with significant impact. On that note, let me pan back to you, Cécile.
So we hope this analysis that we've been working on with Reckitt will be a sound basis for starting conversations with local stakeholders to then engage with local NGOs and local communities to co-design a vision for the landscape and communities we're working on. The analysis is based on global data sets and on global models, a combination of the best we could find at the moment, as well as local information. But we're hoping to dive into local land-based information more in the next few months. So then, over the past 3 days, we've heard stark warnings about the perils of NbS, and we've also heard about the potential for nature-based solutions to create a space for local communities, researchers, business, governments, NGOs to communicate and start understanding each other better. I've got a video now from Will, who unfortunately wasn't able to join us. You might have met him over the past 2 days. He was here, but he was called away at the last minute. So Will is the Director of Nature-Based Solutions at WWF UK, and he sent a few words on WWF's work with corporate partners.
So hi everyone, I'm in the audio booth behind the seats where you're sitting right now. And I'd send my apologies for not being able to join you in person in this session. I was due to, and as luck would have it, after being here for 2.5 days, the last session of the day is when I have had to leave. Unfortunately, my family have come down unwell, so I've got to go home and check they're okay. But nevertheless, I wanted to record this to contribute to the discussion, which I was going to be part of anyway. And Cécile, you asked me to speak on this question of, you know, what trends are we seeing in terms of genuine transition versus greenwashing in businesses? I think the first thing I would say is that there really is greenwashing going on. There's no two ways about it. There are companies who are taking shortcuts towards that transition or making claims that aren't really backed up by science. And that exists. We need to call it out. It needs to be continued to be challenged. At the same time, there is a huge body of companies that are making that genuine transition. And there's a growing number of those, not just on net zero, on nature as well, which is fantastic because the two are obviously completely intertwined. There is, of course, still a large proportion of, the food sector, the energy sector and so on that haven't made those commitments. And so that needs to go a lot further. But if we think about the claims or the work going on within that body of companies who are active on this, within WF, I guess I'm going to have an optimistic view because a little bit we're biased in the sense that we only get to detailed conversations with companies who have made that transition. We're entering into partnerships with companies who've got a commitment to develop science-based targets and stay within 1.5, as I'm sure many, if not all of the organisation in this room do as well. So that tends to give me a bias towards seeing the positives, if you like. But I thought I would share with you a couple of frameworks that we use, that we guide in these conversations, which gives some interesting discussion points for which I'll leave you with before I finish. So the first framework is the corporate climate mitigation blueprint. And you can see that steps 1 to 4 that we advocate for businesses to go through. 1 to 3 are 1 and 2 are very familiar: account and disclose your emissions, set science-based targets to taking those down to a trajectory that's in line with 1.5 degrees, scopes 1 to 3. And then the step further we went was to say, well, if the high bar would be to say, well, what are the remaining emissions that you haven't emitted? Apply a social cost to that, social cost of carbon, and then use that value to be your investment pot, if you like, into one of the 3 things in number 4. It could be taking that back. Your priority number 1, can you take that back and reduce your emissions further through your value chain? That's got to be the priority. If you're going at the fastest pace you possibly can, then you've got the option to potentially invest that in unlocking other climate solutions, whether that's through climate innovation, landscape finance, or thirdly, investing in mitigation outcomes through potentially voluntary carbon market credits, but not necessarily other measured emission reductions are also valid if they're robust and scientific. So then if we get past the point where we think, okay, we've had this debate, we've got this company, there's a clear plan, there's an opportunity to work on nature-based solutions. This then becomes the conversation around the principles of high quality nature-based solutions, or really any nature-based solution, for it to be nature-based solution by its nature, has got to be high quality. This is how we describe what we mean by that in WWF. And the first thing, of course, is right at the core is nature-based solutions have got to deliver people, nature, and climate, not just safeguarding against harm, but delivering positive societal benefit. And we very much articulate that as a triple challenge. So this has got to contribute to delivering the needs of our growing global population while staying within 1.5 and whilst reversing decades of biodiversity loss. Second thing is that scale matters. So let's think about the large scale. Let's go from small scale to large scale. That's where we get more integrity. It's where we get more impact. It's where we can connect with NDCs. Third thing is really important is that there is a role sometimes for credits, generating of credits. It can be a source of income. It could be a means of verification in terms of emission reductions or removals. But it shouldn't be the prioritized need. The prioritization should be, what's the intervention that's going to deliver the transition that people, communities, businesses, and so on want in this given landscape? And how do we invest in that transition, that transformation? And then lastly is, for the delivery organization as well as the funder, it's really important to be transparent. What money's gone where, what benefits have been delivered, what impacts have been measured, and so on. So that frames our discussion, and delivering that high quality approach is very much at the heart of what we're trying to do through our Trillion Trees joint venture with BirdLife International and the Wildlife Conservation Society, as well as our nature-based solutions accelerator, trying to help nature-based projects that can and want to access private finance to do so. That said, the conversations we have in there, they've started to raise some interesting tension points that I think are really interesting to discuss in this group. And they relate to really the claim, where's this grey line behind what's an appropriate claim and what's recognising progress and what's sticking to really high integrity approaches. I'm going to characterise this debate with 3 different perspectives. First one is the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the position on net zero. So this is very much where WF is at. We've backed the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and it provides a really high integrity approach. Essentially, you've got to get to your 90-95% emission reductions through your target if there's a residual amount, then you've got that opportunity to compensate, offset, and deliver net zero. So that's right at the end of the journey, is only when you can claim net zero. We're talking 2040, 2050, etc. Number two would be to take that even further and say, actually, emission reductions and removals through ecosystems isn't really fungible with emissions or avoided emissions from fossil fuels, which arguably has a greater permanence to it. And so there's this argument that nature-based solutions shouldn't have any role in a net zero claim, but should always be an additional investment from a company. And then we have the third viewpoint, which is that for a business to be able to make the case or to create an incentive and to invest in nature-based solutions, there needs to be a nearer term claim for them to make. And this is where I think some of the feedback we're getting on what we're presenting is, well, what can we say in the near term? We can't wait to 2040 or 2045 to make a claim. It's hard to then make that sell into the business to invest in nature-based solutions. And so we have this challenge around, is there something that we can support in terms of a claim that still maintains that high integrity and doesn't detract from the essential need to reduce emissions as a top priority? And I think it'd be really interesting. This is a live discussion, to be completely transparent. This is a live discussion within WWF as it is within other organisations, I'm sure. But what's the creativity? Is there something that maintains that integrity but provides a stronger incentive in the near term? Perhaps the voluntary carbon market integrity initiative has provided some ideas to think about in this regard. I haven't formed a view on it myself. The organisation hasn't, but this gold, silver, bronze approach that some of you will have read about is one possible option where, you know, gold is you've got a target, a net zero target, you're on track and you've offset, but you can't claim net zero, but you're somewhere on that gold standard in terms of claims, and then that gives us perhaps a barometer of greenwashing or not. There's a silver and bronze option, of course. I guess my final thought as we throw into this conversation, I'm just really keen to hear, you know, the viewpoints of the people in the room on this, and I'll watch the recording, and I've got colleagues in the room, and I'll be keen to hear how it goes. But final thought is that I think all of this means that actually what's greenwashing and what isn't is going to become a little bit harder to discern. There'll be some outliers that's really, really obvious, and then there'll be some subtleties where genuinely progressive businesses make claims that we're not sure are completely right, but there's some grey areas in there, and I think that's something that we're still working through as a community, in my view at least. So my apologies I can't be there again. Thanks to the organisers. I thought there was such a diversity of viewpoints over the week. So thank you, Cécile and Nathalie and all the rest of the team. And I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thanks, Will. If you're watching, thank you. I think you reminded me of how Robin Shasden put it very clearly yesterday when she said that offsets need to follow the mitigation hierarchy. So avoid, minimize, remediate, offset. It's just good to keep on saying it. This brings me to Stephanie, who is online. Stephanie is the Director for Biodiversity Compliance and Strategy for Firmenich. She has a strong background in biology and biodiversity and years of experience of working with companies, international organizations, and government on embedding biodiversity in business practices. So please, Stephanie, the floor is yours. What are your insights and recommendations?
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Cécile, for the organization of this session. So I apologize I could not travel, but very nice to meet you virtually, though, for that session. So yeah, indeed, I wanted to resonate a bit of the previous points. I mean, what David shared about how to look into biodiversity and nature-based solution as a business, and as well Will with regard to how this goes together with the climate incentives around the voluntary carbon credit. So my point here is really to look into how and why and how businesses should embed biodiversity in their strategy. Because we've been looking into the perspective with regard to climate due to the interlinks. I mean, we are all living in an ecosystem, and you have the climate, the people, and biodiversity forming that ecosystem. I wanted here to deep dive more on the biodiversity notion, keeping aside a bit the climate perspective, and therefore with the maturity of the system showing how that embedment is actually contributing to the reduction of carbon emission and or the mitigation hierarchy you are referring at, Cécile. This you know, because you're all experts in the domain, but for a company, that's so critical. I mean, usually a company, less and less nowadays, but usually they don't realize how dependent they are on nature and biodiversity. So the first thing for me, it's important for the companies to understand that we, the employees, the consumers, the citizens, we are part of that biodiversity. We are one of the millions of species on the planet and only one. And so if we want to maintain that ecosystem, we need to act because we have definitely strong responsibilities. You have this notion of natural capital, and I'm sure you're aware, I mean, to what extent the ecosystem services are avoiding or creating savings to companies. The main ones that we are very oftenly using is a pollination. And pollination, the nature pollination is avoiding or is allowing us as a company to save, to get the seeds, to get the plant, the flowers, the scents, and the animals, and etc. So that's critical. Another aspect that is important also for company to realize is that consumers and citizens are more and more aware, and they want to understand exactly what David was sharing for their brand. They want to understand what is the product inside, where does that come from, to what extent buying that product is contributing or benefiting to nature and people, and they need to have that level of transparency. So this should become the new normal, to share the transparency, the impact of your consumer act. And this, I'm sure we will be sharing the slides and the deck and with the link so you can go deeper in this study. And therefore, for companies, the most important aspects, and here you see the notion of the mitigation hierarchy as well, is access. You need to understand, and the companies or whatever organization, they need to understand what is their dependence or their impact on nature and biodiversity. They need to commit and set targets so that they can transform. And they can transform to a point where you are reversing nature loss, or you are working on that net gain approach, also mentioned in the mitigation hierarchy. And to do that, we as Firmenich, we've been working in having a standalone pillar on nature. And not a lot of companies are having, a standalone pillar on nature. A lot of environment is linked to climate and etc. But we decided to divide them, not to breach or to break the interlinks, but because they need to be worked in parallel. And when there are convergences, when you can really make this happen conjointly, then it's a win situation. Here it's a short slide to share the company our 2025 targets around climate, around nature, and people. We have more than 54 indicators that we are tracking on a yearly basis throughout our annual reporting exercise. This is a snapshot of the main ones that we feel that are the one creating an impact. So you can see the commitment we have on the notion of climate, on the scope 1 and 2 reduction, kicking off, let's say, the scope 3 part, which is always the most challenging one for a company. And with the overall objective to be carbon neutral by 2030 within our operations, so scope 1 and 2. And then we have notions of restoration activities in our own manufacturing sites. We want to increase the responsible sourcing approach so that we can really mitigate the impact that we have in our value chain related to promoting biodiversity. And the whole aspect of people is definitely key to any businesses having a lot of employees, but as well having direct link with consumer, ensuring a health diet or nutritious diet, but as well a healthy product to be used, like the one that Reckitt is producing. This being said, how do we tackle the notion of nature within Firmenich. So the first thing is that we've been looking into what is happening around us. Okay, we know we have understood our dependencies and impacts, but how can we contribute to all these, everything that is happening? I mean, yeah, so many things have happened since 2009 when I started to work on biodiversity. Now we are at reaching maybe a COP15 agreement in Montreal. Let's see how it goes. And you have more and more awareness on that. And you have this notion of science-based target that is quite well known for the climate, and it's starting to get through for nature as well. And we are part of what we call the corporate engagement program. So we also contribute to setting the guidance, piloting the KPIs of the interim target they're working on, and we track and monitor what is actually the ambition of the UN related to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And this allows us to set an enabling environment, but we cannot work alone. So within our solutions, we are looking into collective actions. Two of them are very relevant for our industry and for the work on biodiversity. The first one, so the first logo here is One Planet Business for Biodiversity. It's a business coalition promoting regenerative agriculture. So just to be aware, we know that there are a lot of discussion about a clear definition of regenerative agriculture versus agroecology and etc. Here, the coalition is not necessarily to be or to define the definition of regenerative agriculture, but it's really to create a momentum where we want companies to change the agricultural system. They should not accept anymore the conventional agricultural system. They need to think differently, and we need to create an impact. And the notion of regenerative agriculture through that coalition is looked through an impact perspective, so change. And then to guide us in terms of how can we change our sourcing behavior, because as you understand with regard to nature and biodiversity, our main impact lies in our value chain. I mean, David, you were sharing about your latex overview, and as well for the fragrance, some of the fragrance ingredients. Everything is happening there, far from us, far from our head office, nicely settled in the Europe. Everything is happening in other countries with farmers, be they big farmers or smallholder farmers. And we need to be guided here. We cannot, reinvent the wheel or think that we know everything of what is happening in such country. So we as Firmenich, we decided to get support from the Union for Ethical Biotrade, which gives us a guiding principles with that, because they have a standard and we have auditing process, annual reporting exercise, so we can continuously improve the way we are looking into sourcing and biodiversity. So in a summary, how are we embedding nature within our ecosystem? So here you can see that it's everywhere. It's in our sites. In our manufacturing sites, we have started to work and develop a toolkit to activate restoration activities in sites where there is a confirmed risk based on their location. These are two projects we have started to pilot with regards to following the interim target of the science-based target for nature. But as well in our innovation, because we are, and it's true that I have not introduced our company, but we are a fragrance and flavor company, meaning that we are an intermediaries in the whole value chain of your product. So if you take, if you allow me, David, I will continue with your brands, because like this people can keep one single example. But if you take the finished product from Reckitt, you have that scent, so that scent that confirm you that it's clean. So you have the active ingredients that Reckitt and the supplier of Reckitt is providing, and we are providing the scent. We can provide also the flavor of food product. And even in the solution we are developing for our customer, therefore the brands, we are looking in decreasing as much as possible the impact of our solution towards the environment. And this is one of the technologies that is mainly looking at the biodegradability for what we call the rinse-off product. So all the product that ends into the water flow. So whether it's fresh water or the ocean, depending on the region and the wastewater treatment of the cities. As I mentioned to you, a lot to be done in our value chain and the supply chain transparency. So again, we don't aim at being the expert in everything. What we aim at is ensuring that we are choosing the right partner, the right tools to drive the change. So as you can see in that flow is what are the tools we have chosen at what step of the value chain, so that we can at some point of time of the complexity of the value chain reach out to what we call the collectors, so the producers of the raw extract, so let's say the basic essential oil that are in contact with the farmers, so that we can reach them and we can work with them to support them towards verified sustainable practices. The certification schemes here are not necessarily to be claimed on a product, because the types of solution in terms of formula will not necessarily support such a claim, but to ensure that when we are working on a naturally derived ingredient, we have a good level of guarantee that sustainable practices are in place. If we want to go a step further in terms of really measuring an impact, we are doing it in a very, let's say, a smaller portfolio, because we cannot act everywhere and be everywhere at the same time. But we do have projects where we are measuring the impact. Just to give you a sense of size of the, not necessarily the business, but the dependencies we have on nature. We are working with more than 430 species, be they plant species or animal species, which represent more than 3,000 ingredients. So you can imagine that, and I'm talking about ingredient, I'm not talking about supply chain and with the complexity of having several manufacturers to supply one same ingredient. So you can imagine that the complexity, so we need to make choice, and we work on a risk-based approach. We cannot measure impacts everywhere, but we do on critical supply chain or emblematic supply chain. And my almost last point is how it reach the product that we are providing to our customer. And we have a proprietary tool that allows us and enables us to share to our clients, be they the brands, the actual impact of the formula. Just for you to know, a formula, if we take the fragrance business, is at least composed from 50 or 150 ingredients. Okay, it's a small product. It's not just a hint of one essential oil. It's a complex formula. So we need it, and we defined our own proprietary tool. We're using life cycle analysis data from Quantis mainly. We are looking into integrating biodiversity metrics into the system and the approach that we can provide to the client, so that can support us in improving the way we create the formula, and that also guide and contribute to the ambition of our clients, which is, when you look at that notion of amendment, is key, because if we want to transform, we need to have everyone on board, and we need to convince our clients that a transformation is possible, and we need to work together so that the transformation is happening. And to conclude, to loop it back to the notion of nature-based solution, as Firmenich, we are looking into the concept of nature-based solutions in two places of the cycle. You've seen the ecosystem I shared with you. One is related to the restoration activities linked to our manufacturing sites. We are working with IUCN on looking into potential, with their nature-based solution standard, to see whether or not it can be not audited, but looked in through their eyes, and see if a business with a project that is not necessarily huge in terms of scalability can start to contribute to somehow a notion of nature-based solution. And through what David shared earlier, through the work with Reckitt and the Oxford University on this notion of nature-based solution in setting. So how can we look into that notion of nature-based solution that really benefits to nature and people in the supply chain? So in the product that you are consuming as a business or as a consumer. So we are in the making, and we've been working on 3 key ingredients that maybe you know. I mean, patchouli is quite known, but then you have the clove here, the citrus, and this is a patchouli. So this is what I wanted to share with you in terms of how a business can embed biodiversity on the ways they are looking into their strategy, on the different tools they can pull together without undermining the climate roadmap. And when maturity of these 2 pillars are strong enough, then we will definitely make the interlinks and we will be able to measure the carbon sequestration of different projects and etc. So we can really go a step further in that convergences, let's say.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thanks, that was brilliant and great to have your insights on the complexities of integrating biodiversity and human well-being into the core business of operations to generate benefits along your supply chains for nature, people, and climate. And this is a point, as you say, that we keep on coming back to. How do we connect the net zero targets and the biodiversity strategies to invest in biological carbon sinks that are net zero aligned, as well as ecologically sound and socially just? And I was meant to have Pedro Moura Costa, the director of BVRio, an NGO that specializes in market solutions for different types of environmental issues here. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it, but he has a wealth of experience in carbon markets, and he's been working on carbon markets since the 1990s when he started Eco-Securities and the first carbon market projects. But he did send us from Brazil a few words that he would like to say. It's actually more than a few words, and I hope I understand it. But I'll read it out for you. So carbon climate finance is back and allows us to finance a series of environmental activities that were devoid of funding since the era of the Kyoto Protocol, the Kyoto Protocol came to an end in 2012. Tens of billions of dollars are being mobilized and made available to these activities through different routes. First, there's direct corporate investments from companies with science-based targets. Then carbon credit funding from traders that provide liquidity to this sector. Then multi-billion-dollar investment funds being assembled to invest in this space. For example, he gives TMASC's $5 billion Gen Zero fund, etc., etc. Unlike Kyoto, though, carbon funding now embraced NbS, finally. And this creates a unique opportunity to combine these 2 objectives in initiatives that bring both a positive climate impact as well as biodiversity protection. Investors welcome projects that bring more than only climate benefits, as made evident through a survey we conducted as part of the so he works for the Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative and as part of the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative dialogues process. Good governance initiatives such as the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative will also aim at driving corporate demand to good quality credits, ensuring positive co-benefits, including biodiversity and social inclusion. It is up to you in this conference to join forces and make sure we use the current wave of climate finance to design and implement projects and initiatives that combine the dual objectives of climate change mitigation and biodiversity protection. So that was from Pedro. Thank you so much if you're listening. And I think we will continue discussing this in the discussion. There's always a lot of vivid discussion when we start bringing carbon markets up. Who's next? Yes, so in an inspiring keynote yesterday, Mark Plenay talked about the circular bioeconomies, and he specifically mentioned a new economic paradigm where life, bio, is the true engine and purpose. And talking about bioeconomies always reminds me of the work Natura and Co. are doing, and very inspiring work you're doing around this. And I would like to invite Keyvan Macedo, who is the director of Natura & Co.'s sustainability vision, Commitment to Life, to introduce some of the most ambitious projects you have.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Cécile, for the invitation. I'm very honored to be part of this panel. And I think that I'm a little bit scared because I do not decided to use any PowerPoint to tell the stories and the actions that we are doing inside Natura & Co. So Natura & Co is a group that gather 4 iconic beauty brands. So Avon with all these women empowerment. We have The Body Shop always advocating for activism, especially with no animal testing. We have an Australian brand called Aesop that always trying to look for excellence and perfection. And then we have the mother company of the group that is Natura, that is a Brazilian company. And I would like to share some storytellings about how we have been embedding biodiversity and sustainability in a general terms inside the business model of the company. I think that you touched, Cécile, in a very important point that 2 years ago we launched what we call the Commitment to Life, which is our 2030 sustainability vision. That the idea is how we can try to address the main issues of the world. So basically we split 31 targets in 3 different pillars. The first pillar to address climate crisis and to protect the Amazon. Of course, the Amazon is the biome that, because we have the headquarters in Brazil, is most important for us, but of course understand Amazon representing biodiversity and nature in general terms. The second pillar, of course, related to human rights, but also to be humankind. And the third pillar, to embrace circularity and regeneration. By the end, we are going to realize that those 31 targets that are split into the 3 different pillars, in the end, they are interconnected. So when we are talking about all the challenge that we are facing to try to achieve our commitment on net zero, it means that we will need to have some regenerative and nature-based solution to address that. And also we will have to apply circularity principles to address our carbon footprint related to our packaging. But when we are talking about inspirations, let's go backwards. 30 years ago, we have a very important event in Rio 92. And over there, the founders of Natura was very inspired and decided that how we can try to use these guidance and try to shift a little bit the business model that we have. So after some years thinking about how we can try to create a little bit and a business model that try to transform all the social and environmental challenges in a new business model, we create a line called ECOS, or ECOS. And the idea of this line, it was how we can try to introduce the Brazilian biodiversity to the Brazilian citizenship in a way that we can try to create a sustainable supply chain that we can preserve. And normally we are hearing a lot about bioeconomy, but we prefer to call how we can try to create this economy of the standing forest. So how we can give more value to the forest stand instead of just chopping down the trees. We are discussing, before we jump in the panel, about, of course, local communities or indigenous communities, they want also to have prosperity. Maybe the reference of prosperity can be a little bit different, but by the end, they also need to bring food at the table. So we need to show them there is another alternative instead of just simply deforestation. So the idea is that how we can be inspired even by the traditional knowledge of those local communities and try to develop products that we can combine those bio-ingredients, applying the principles of the fair trade and also applying the principles of the conventional biological diversity, paying access and benefit sharing, And in some of the cases, how we can even recognize the ecosystem service that they pay whenever they are remaining with the standing forest. So by the end, one of the lessons learned that we have is that there is no silver bullet, but also we cannot bet the entire feasibility of the project just betting on carbon credit or even on biodiversity credit. So that is the reason that we try to combine in the baskets of the communities so many different sources of the income. I think that the other important aspect that we realize is that how we can try to combine forces with others. Because by the end, this work is just addressing what we call the specialities. So I think that we have been hearing from Stefan how we can try to scale up. And when we are talking about scale up, we need to shift to commodities. So one of the things that we try to combine and nature-based solution in our value chain is how we can prove that we can try to source palm oil, which is one of the commodities that we use a lot in our value chain, using agroforest system solutions. So how we can try to combine different species, try to increase the resilience of the value chain, and at the same time, of course, preserve and give value about ecosystem service. So I think that one of the challenges that we are facing today is that how we can create those funding mechanisms to try to expand these, how we can create partnership even with our competitors to try to expand these in larger scale. But more than that, one of the demands that we are seeing from our stakeholders and even from some of our customers is that how we can try to show transparency about the actions that we are doing. And more than that, I think that the private sector has been more and more demand about accountability about our actions. So that is the importance, and I think that later on Andrew is going to touch a little bit about TNFD, is that how we can try to working on in a common framework that is going to be easier for the private sector to try to report, but also, and I think especially from the capital markets to understand and to evaluate one company and then the other one. Because I think that David touched a little bit about risk management. And I think that by the end is how we can try to give to the capital markets the way that we are structurizing our business and how we can try to introduce in our business model those concepts in a way that we can try to minimize and eventually in some ways we can create the positive and generate the positive impact in our value chain. So by the end, of course, the capital markets should benefit those companies that try to address those main issues that we are facing as humankind. In the other hand, they can give more difficulties, or of course the cost of the access to the capital is going to be increased. So in general terms, those are the challenges that we are facing. I think that it's not only this timeline and this storytelling is not only related to Natura brand. I think that for those who knows The Body Shop, since Anita Roddick found the company, he has been fighting to try to establish what she called the community fair trade systems with different parts of regions of the world, with different kinds of communities. I think that in the case of Natura, we prefer to focus, because of course we are based in Brazil, in the Amazon regions, and there's no need to explain what is the importance of the Amazon rainforest, not only related to the Paris Agreement, but also related to the health and to the biodiversity infrastructure that we have globally. So I think that there are other examples, but maybe during the Q&A sessions we might jump in and comment.
Thanks. Thank you. So on day one of our speakers, Aline, presented that in Brazil, deforestation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, and that implementing the forest code would get Brazil to get to their net zero target by 2050. But given ill governance, the involvement of private sector is critical for this. And we have today Niki, who is Executive Director of Global Canopy, Niki Mardas, and Andy Boulding, who is here from TNFD. I will ask you both to talk about what businesses can do, what they need to prepare for in the next few years. But first, I wanted to ask you, Niki, to talk about the report you published last week on deforestation and net zero.
Great, thanks, Cécile. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I've learned a huge amount in 90 minutes. I wish I'd been here for three days. So, yeah, we look at market impacts and dependencies on nature. We're a non-profit down the road in Oxford. And maybe I could just take a tiny step back. I know we're probably running short of time, but I'll take a tiny step back and then come on to the report. So, I mean, it's great, obviously, that we saw nature center stage at COP26, which, Cécile, you've already referred to, and I think the UK does deserve some credit for that, because, you know, I first went to COP13, where, you know, forests were on the table. It's taken half the COPs to really bring it up to the sort of leadership level, which makes not that much sense when you consider what we've all been hearing, or what we all know, that deforestation is, you know, just the biggest of, I don't want to say the biggest, because then I'll get in trouble, but you know, among the biggest of the environmental no-brainers that we can tackle to address this crisis because of climate, as we've heard, you know, 11% of emissions, biggest chunk of Brazilian emissions, but, you know, if deforestation was a country, it'd be the third biggest emitter overall. Of course, nature, which is our subject here, with all the deep interconnections that you've been hearing about here, which of course, you know, the impacts for water, for biodiversity are just absolutely colossal. And then critically for people as well, and 1.6 billion. I mean, please, researchers, please update that number. We've been using it for 5 years, but, you know, 1.6 billion people that depend on forests. Talking of dependencies for business, you know, let's talk about dependencies for people, for human beings, and all the ways that they're connected. And, you know, if we need we've talked about metrics, we've heard about metrics quite rightly. You know, if you want a sort of ultimate sort of simple proxy metric for catastrophe, you know, to get a hectare of forest as a proxy for all these ills, and it's something we can see from space. And, you know, we should maybe not get too complicated about some of the metrics that we use, which is, I think, a point that has been made here by others. And if, you know, 40% of land-based mitigation potential, which you talked about, Cécile, is from stopping deforestation and other land use change, then, you know, we really better get on with it. And the time factor has been raised as well. And despite this sense of urgency, you know, we've seen deforestation going up consistently. Brazil on fire, an area the size of London lost in May. Anyway, all stuff you know, but I think it brings me to the point that, you know, while, well, maybe take a step back and just say, you know, think about some of the drivers like cattle. 20% of cattle from Brazil, produced in Brazil, is exported. The world's biggest driver of deforestation, and the biggest in Brazil. 20% is exported, but it's still, even with 20% exports, it's still the world's biggest export market of cattle. It's just a colossal amount of cattle being exported off the back of, you know, the forest. It's not all from deforestation regions, but it's the biggest driver of deforestation. Soy, obviously, the same story. And we know that there's enough degraded land. I'm sure you've heard it in other sessions, and it's been well analyzed, that there's a lot of degraded land that could be restored. That creates opportunity for investment. And David, I do agree, sorry, David, that we should be talking about opportunity. It is interesting, but risk is pretty darn interesting too. You know, I mean, it's not boring to talk about just the colossal risks that we face, and therefore, you know, the absolute prerogative for focus and action on the risk side, because pointing in the other direction from the 20 billion that you mentioned, that you put on the table, Cécile, at the front, you know, it's a good number, mainly because it's bigger than what we've had before for tackling deforestation in nature, but it's still a tiny, tiny number. You know, maybe the 1.7 billion for land rights is the best piece of that puzzle, you know, which could really leverage change. But that 20 billion is fighting against colossal sums going in the other direction that all of us are connected to through our food, our fiber, our feed, our fashion, you know, all of this stuff in our finance. So 1 trillion plus in agricultural subsidies that we're helping to, you know, which are blind to environmental and social and certainly nature criteria in most cases. 7 trillion you mentioned in financial flows not into at-risk companies, the most at-risk companies. This is analysis we've done. The most 350 most linked to deforestation receive 7 trillion in private finance across the supply chain. You know, I mean, in companies across sectors, and half of that, so you know, or almost half of that, so whatever it is, 3 trillion, is by financial institutions which are ignoring this issue. So financial institutions without commitments or without policies on deforestation are responsible for half of that money going into the highest risk sectors. And, you know, is it any wonder, I mean, we're again talking about metrics, you know, ESG metrics. The problem is not so much that I think that we don't have the metrics or the data. It's that in the case of ESG funds or ESG metrics, nature's just being ignored, you know. And we've done a new study which will come out soon, I hope, just looking at ESG funds and the amount of deforestation associated with ESG, you know, labeled ESG funds. And the amounts are staggering. And to address, and I, you know, I've got the numbers here and I would love to share them with you, but I'm conscious of time, but, you know, can talk about it later if it's relevant. But, you know, the take-home message is that you don't have to do much to recognize where that colossal amount of deforestation is, and using our tool Trace Finance, we've got quantitative metrics on that, but they're just being ignored because nature's not on the radar in this instance, or indeed Scope 3 emissions, because if Scope 3 emissions were considered, then, you know, deforestation would be captured that way. So moving on, how to tackle the wall of money is the question, and to tackle that risk. So we had 8.7 or something, you know, a number like that, around 8 trillion in assets under management. 34 financial institutions at COP26 made a commitment to take deforestation out of their supply chains by 2025. That's actually quite a courageous thing to get up and say you're going to do, because, you know, 2025 is not very far away, but it can be done. We know it can be done. We know the data's there. We know you know, there's enough there. That point's already been made. But there's only one bank there that has joined. You know, so the whole of the banking sector is absent from that commitment, and we need far, far more to join these quite courageous financial institutions in stepping up to that commitment, because only then can we balance out the finance that is going against forests, not with the 20 billion, but more hopefully with the 7 trillion, but clearly that's not enough either for various reasons. So finally, the report, which you asked me about, I can briefly come on to this report. So last week at London Climate Action Week, leaders met to hammer home, really just to hammer home a key message between COPs convened by the high-level climate champions. And the message was that there's no reaching net zero without deforestation. I mean, it's not that we didn't know that, you know, we all know that, but it is very significant and important that it was put center stage as a critical message by the Race to Zero and the climate champions. And so they Race to Zero commissioned us, Global Canopy, and the Science Based Targets Initiative and the Accountability Framework Initiative to do a report, which Cécile referred to. And in that report, we looked at those in the Race to Zero, meaning high quality, you know, ambitious, more ambitious than others at least, net zero targets. And of those, we looked at the highly exposed companies, the 350 most highly exposed companies to deforestation, agriculture and other sectors, flag sectors. And the results of the analysis show that only 9 companies of the 148 who had serious commitments of the most exposed, so, you know, 40% of the most exposed have good net zero commitments. Great. So only 9 companies, which is 6% of that number, are making significant progress on deforestation. Doesn't mean they're completely winning, but they're taking it seriously. They're making progress across all parts of the puzzle that are critical to see progress. They are not greenwashing. Let's put it that way. And that means that more than 90%, or maybe they are, but they're doing a very good job of, they're putting so much effort in that case into greenwashing that we should salute them anyway. But more than 90% of companies, therefore, who have made strong net zero commitments and are highly, highly exposed to deforestation, very large companies, are on course to miss their net zero commitment because they are not making progress on deforestation, which we've heard earlier is very important to make early progress on for all the reasons that we know. And the other 60% haven't even made net zero commitments, let alone making progress on deforestation. So that's not a great picture, but it's a bad picture, but the positive side of the coin is the political momentum around this, which, okay, we had that political momentum at COP, which is great, but I was extremely heartened to see last week this event, the sole focus on deforestation, and the fact that I'm sure some of you know, but is quite recent, which is the Race to Zero have added to their criteria, their leadership criteria, a requirement to make progress on removing deforestation from activities, supply chains, and financing. So that is hugely significant, because where that leads you, if you join the dots from that means that technically speaking, the whole of the Glasgow Alliance for Net Zero Finance, or whatever they're called, GFANZ, with 130 trillion, so now we're talking, that 130 trillion, which is in the Race to Zero, now is associated with a leadership commitment to remove deforestation from their portfolios. So that is very interesting. And Nigel Topping, who is one of the two high-level climate champions, really ended with a very forceful and inspiring call to action on that point and said, look, you're not going to stay in the Race to Zero if you're not making progress on deforestation. You can't stay in the Race to Zero if you are doing that. So that was heartening to hear, because it's a bridge between these super high-level commitments. It's still top-down, right? Let's not kid ourselves. We need action on the ground, and other people are talking about that in critically important. But we also need top-down action. And so here it's still top-down, but it is grounded and real and embedded into net zero. And that, I think, is some good news among the more distressing news.
Good to hear some good news. You say nature is not on the agenda yet. It increasingly is, and I guess as we see that this is ramping up, the focus on nature is ramping up for businesses, and as the work on TNFD and SBTN is increasing, what can businesses expect to have to report on in the next few years, and to what can they expect really?
Great. Well, maybe I'll give try and give you a shorter thing on this. I mean, when we talked about this together a little bit, we were talking about the need for, regulation and the need for mandatory frameworks and so on. And so I won't say, the TNFD, counterpart to the TCFD, it has some critical differences in approach, learning really from the TCFD experience. But that twinning of the TCFD and the Paris Agreement, we hope we'll see an equivalent in a twinning of a TNFD, which is actually front-running a little bit the global biodiversity deal, which we hope will have real progress in Montreal. TNFD is, it's a risk management and it's a disclosure framework. It just published its second edition. Natura, remember, there are over 30 members. There's a new beta version of the framework. It's proceeding in a kind of what is called an open innovation model at real speed to have a framework available by the end of 2023. So, why another framework is a question that gets asked quite a lot, and why a voluntary one at that. And genuinely, I think, to get to some substantive points, I mean, I think you know, the voluntary is really important, fostering leadership and innovation, but we know it's not going to get sector-wide change. And you can look at, going back to deforestation, you know, we had 2020 commitments, you know, look how well that went. It did foster leadership, it did foster innovation, the current commitment, the current progress is based on that. But, you know, what we're seeing now is leading companies supporting legislation, due diligence legislation in the UK, because they want to level the playing field. You know, in the UK, in the EU, hopefully in the States, you know, okay, that's maybe a pipe dream, but there's action in China and so on. So we're beginning to see this come for this impact area, for deforestation, which I think is critically important. And one of the critiques of this is it doesn't apply to finance, right? So what the UK, to take the UK example, has said is, you know, finance will come through other measures, and the TCFD, the climate equivalent, is being made mandatory in the UK from 2025. So I think the big question, when you look at the TNFD, is, you know, how quickly post 2023, when the framework will hopefully be completed, you know, how quickly can it be adopted? Can it be taken on? So piloting is really important to iron out. You know, we're basically on a super speed sort of journey here with the TNFD. It's like the sort of younger sibling that has the benefit of seeing the older sibling, you know, kind of copies the older sibling, and so there's a shortcut, and the parents are sort of exhausted from, you know, don't say, well, you can't do that anymore, and so the pathways seem to be a bit more open, and there's a built-in expectation that we'll move into legislation. And, you know, Zach Goldsmith said very recently, I mean, obviously it's not a day for necessarily thinking about where UK politics is going, but Zach Goldsmith made the point very recently that, you know, the TCFD is coming on board in UK regulation, and while it's not yet government policy, that is what he as a minister would expect and like to see from the UK. So when will that happen? Somewhere between 2024 at the very earliest, and, you know, please God, before 2030, but, you know, let's see, let's hope. I mean, this is where I think we all need to push to get this system on board much earlier. And, you know, I have a bunch of reflections about how what's needed to become legislation. You know, there's endorsement from the G7. This alignment point is critical. It's got to be seen to be aligned and be aligned with everything else in the way that has been said here. So all those steps are being taken. It's part of a strategy. And what will that mean for businesses down the line? Well, that, you know, you're able to look at your scope 1, 2, and 3 intersection with nature in real locations in the world and understand your impacts, dependencies, and therefore risks and opportunities associated with them. And we've heard from other panelists here that great progress is being made in some of these areas, but wow, that's a lot to do and it's challenging, and let's not underestimate how much we need to make that a reality. Part of making that a reality, I will stop now, is piloting, and that's where I think, and you know, maybe Andy is going to say a little bit about that and how we can really test things in the market.
Thanks. So Andy, I'll hand over.
Yeah, sure, happy to do so. Maybe just a little bit of background to me. I'm seconded into the TNFD, or partly seconded into the TNFD to support on the piloting side, as well as the development of specific guidance. In terms of what Niki has already said, obviously the TNFD is developing this risk management and disclosure framework, and in terms of the development of the framework, it's very important that the framework itself is globally inclusive and fit for purpose. So this is where the kind of piloting really starts to come in. And the TNFD, as of the start of July, is really trying to help accelerate and encourage the piloting of the framework. So we're on our second version of the framework, so beta version at the moment, which, has various different components to it. It talks about different definitions when thinking about assessing nature-related risks and opportunities. Has a voluntary leap process, which is all about the kind of journey an organization can take in assessing and measuring and disclosing their nature-related risks and opportunities as well. So there's various different elements to this beta version, and that came out at the end of June. And in terms of the kind of piloting, as I said, looking to be globally inclusive. So, even from what David said, the work that obviously has been going on at Reckitt, there's lots of really valuable insights that can be gathered by various different organizations to help inform the development of the framework. So the aim with the TNFD is to really try and influence and encourage pilots in various different jurisdictions through various different geographies, various different sectors, industries, the insights from those, which will be kind of collated and analysed by the end of June 2023, will help inform this final set of recommendations that will be released by the TNFD in 2023.
Thank you. Thanks. We're looking forward to working on that. I do have questions from online, and I will start taking questions from the audience for the discussion. But before we take questions, I have a question to you. We have such a broad range of expertise here, and we've been hearing from many of you over the past 3 days. And I'm wondering if you have recommendations or you have things you would like to see businesses investing in and businesses doing for biodiversity, climate, human well-being as we continue working on this. Oh, loads of hands. James? No, someone will come.
One of the things I think from business, and I think it builds on Niki's point that he made really clearly, is that actually opportunity is great, and we really value what people do around nature positive, and how to build that alignment in towards 2030 in businesses, and I think that's critical, that continues. But I think the important is the word and I think risk is critical here, and I think there's, and putting our hand up, I think there's unintended consequences. So for example, when we talk about deforestation free, and what the banks are doing, we're focusing on a few key commodities there. And one thing I suppose is a question to Reckitt is the value of advocacy here. So rubber is often not included in EU legislation. But when you look at the context in certain places, for example, Cameroon, rubber is probably one of the key drivers of deforestation and conversion. You look at some global forest watch data. So I think it's critical that just because the EU regulation and a lot of people are focused on other commodities, that actually the rubber industry steps up. But actually what we're seeing is the European tyre and rubber industry actively lobbying against the inclusion of rubber, although we've focused on certain key commodities. So it was just understanding how Reckitt, obviously understanding the nature positive stuff you're doing, but rubber is a key driver of deforestation. And the role that Reckitt as a progressive organisation could have with your own lobbying industry in Europe to make sure that rubber is included or taking steps to be included in this regulation. And when we say zero deforestation, we mean across the board, not just in the 4 key commodities that have been looked at. And it's just a commitment that the advocacy role is critical for corporations, not just about getting their own house in order. It's about bringing the whole industry with you.
Thanks, James. It'd be great to work with you on that. Should I take a question here?
So if I may extend on what you're proposing, I hear a lot about deforestation, but we have more habitats, more ecosystems. So when we talk about the Amazon, it's not only a forest, it's a river, and we're losing freshwater habitats 3 times faster than forests. So that's a request. We have to look at other type of ecosystems, not only forests. So it's freshwater habitats, it's grasslands, which also have a very relevant role to play, it's coastlands. Yeah, there's a lot of work for you to do, guys.
I'll take one more and then I'll let the panel respond. Alex?
Thank you. What a great panel. I really enjoyed that. So, as I think we learned, I mean, there's like a focus on climate, biodiversity, and people within the roadmap that was presented for nature-based insetting and Reckitt. And I'm wondering for our friends who come from the corporate world, what happens when you when you speak about that to company leadership in relation to the simultaneous need to ensure returns and could you speak a little bit about the extent to which long-term thinking is instilled in or is being instilled in companies, and I'm also interested in the fact that we have here, if I'm not mistaken, we have both publicly listed and private companies. So does that make a difference in relation to my question? Thank you.
Okay, I'll let the panel respond then. Yeah, whoever wants to take it, yeah? You've got it.
This should be switched on. Are we on? Yeah. Can you hear me okay? James, let me start with that. Look, I think at the end of the day, risk or opportunity, it's sort of irrelevant. What we actually all agreed on is that there's a need for change. And I think you dial up whichever is the most motivating for the different stakeholders, but you don't lose track of either. And I think your point about unintended consequences is spot on. My biggest fear in some of this discussion is that you end up being siloed in the interventions and the approaches that you take, climate-related, biodiversity, social. You know, if you're not looking across the three of them, then the unintended consequences that come in the other two would create more problems for the future. So I don't disagree with anything you were saying, and I think it's a horses for courses conversation, which is not a nature-based solution, by the way. To your point on advocacy, totally. Because this is where everybody has a voice that can be raised. And as you were saying, Niki, this question about how this translates through to policy will come from politicians all over the world hearing different sectors talking positively about how this can happen and be brought to pass. If they don't hear that, then politicians don't make policy that's going to be running the risk of losing them votes. One hates to put it as bluntly as that, particularly on a day like today, as you said. So speaking out on this type of issue, I think you will see more and more businesses doing it. One, to try and create a level playing field. Two, to try and create a momentum behind activity, because they cannot do it, as I said earlier, on their own. We can't do it, even in some of the value chains like latex, where we are quite big in certain areas, because actually another part of it, we're not the sole user at all. I think you raise a really challenging point when you get sector differential, if you like, between the tyre sector and, I mean, in volume terms, we're tiny compared to anything that the tyre sector do, but that doesn't stop us talking about it. And it also doesn't stop us talking about the approaches of nature-based solutions or fair rubber or the other approaches that we're building within this to try and make that happen. And we will continue to talk about that as we did at COP. To your point about it's clearly not just forestry systems. I have the very complex slide I put up before, and we talk a lot within that about aquatic ecosystems, and we have other partnerships already looking and doing a lot of work on restoration of aquatic ecosystems, because you have to see it in the round. And then last but not least, Alex, your point about what happens when you talk to leaders about this. There's always going to be a tension. There's a particular tension at the moment between short and longer term conversations. But I think there is an understanding that short-term gain at the expense of long-term, it does no longer stacks up and hasn't stacked up for a long time. And that's when businesses sometimes use a sort of different type of language. And I was talking with, where's James? James is in the audience somewhere. We were talking at lunchtime about the lexicon around all of this. If we can get a much more common understanding of the language, then I think actually we have a greater opportunity to drive change. Business will sometimes talk about resiliency. Resiliency in the business context of the longer term dynamic you were talking about is very much around recognizing that a global value chain that is based on an ecosystem needs to have longevity. To have longevity, it has to have a biodiversity context. It has to have a climate context. It absolutely has to have a social context for the farmers involved. And there is a much greater recognition of that resilience that you build in a different way. I think, I don't know, my perspective on this, and I'm going to, let me frame it this way. There is a much greater understanding that you don't commoditize things. In the past, I don't think people understood that. And people bought stuff and it was a commodity. I think there was an increasing understanding of the incredible complexity of the value chains and the ecosystems within the broadest level. And therefore, nothing is a commodity. Because, as Niki was saying, when you think about nature-related solutions, you think different if you're not just between this country and that country, but between this part of this country and that part of that country. And you have to get much more specific. By definition, that's no longer a commodity, because the interventions has to take those local specific things into account. That adds complexity, don't get me wrong, but there's an understanding there that you have to have a solution that is targeted and is appropriate to the origin you're involved with.
If I may just complement and try to share a little bit of concern, let's say, from the corporate side. Yes, I think that, yes, I agree that we need to take a look about, especially the medium and long term, and depend on the target and the time frame that we are talking about. Normally, we have just one cycle of investments. So that is the concern, how we can guarantee that these investments will address all the issues that we have. Because sometimes all the targets that we need to achieve by 2030, probably we have just a single cycle of investment by 2025. So we need to guarantee and we need to map that the roadmap is going to address everything. And it seems to me more and more the complexity about the frameworks and even the metrics are not so simple to address. Let me just offer the example. When we're talking about TCFD, it's easier because there is no concern about local issues. When we're talking about TNFD, and let me use the example that we have made a partnership with WWF, and we run an example in Brazil, in the Atlantic Forest. So we're talking about the same country, the same biome, but different regions in the same country. We have totally different results. So that is the complexity when we are talking about a huge value chain, because then you need to map, and probably because of to reduce the risk of sourcing, normally the companies have so many different areas that we source the same ingredients or the same materials at the same time. So how we can do and apply the same metrics in different regions.
Alexia and Stephanie, do you have comments?
And just to complement that, I do think that this tension between long-term thinking and short-term thinking is incredibly challenging, particularly because most corporates, particularly publicly traded corporates, tend to think in quarterly timeframes, right? So, and occasionally annually, but rarely longer than that. And so as we think about, what are very long-term transition timelines and what are interventions that are going to require, significant amounts of patience and combined policy and investment, change and mobilization, I think we really need to figure out a way to engage corporates on timelines that are meaningful to them. And I guess the last thing I'll say on this point as well is that, companies operate, in current capitalist right? And it's an economy that is built on unpriced externalities by and large, which means that, it's really challenging for some companies to integrate these unpriced externalities in a meaningful way while their competitors are not. And many companies are doing so. I think the situation in Europe versus the US is quite different from a regulatory and policy context. And so that also impacts, companies' ability to move quickly. But overall, voluntary commitments and programs can be an incredible ambition enabler and can help us collectively raise the ambition bar, particularly in places where the regulatory environment and policy environment hasn't yet caught up. But it's really important to recognize volunteer leaders for the leadership that they're providing and offering, to support the fact that they are mobilizing finances that they would not otherwise be required to mobilize, and to really work collectively together to solve this problem in a way that doesn't allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good, and that doesn't disincentivize near-term action and impact because companies are so concerned about being called out or being criticized for the actions that they're undertaking today. So thanks for the discussion. It's been really excellent, and happy to answer additional questions as well.
Well, on that point, we do have a couple of questions from online, and the very difficult question of how do we stop greenwashing? Discuss.
I'm looking the other way.
Stephanie, are you taking that one?
Well, I can start, but anyway, so how to avoid greenwashing? I would say a bit of the discussion we just had prior to that question. It's about, okay, what are the voluntary initiatives that are credible enough so that the companies that can follow is credible in avoiding greenwashing. So the notion of reporting and disclosure is very important. I mean, to add a bit on the point of the TNFD being one of the initiative, you also have the GRI that have GRI for biodiversity. Okay, it's a small one because it was created earlier, but they are reviewing their biodiversity reporting initiatives here. So if we have such tools as business, then we can build trust and we can build credibility on our actions. And transparency is key because having key messages in terms of walking the talk is always great because it's illustrative of the complexity and the challenging we are facing. So what Keyvan you were sharing is so important to illustrate and vulgarize, but at the end, we also, and we are all working, all the people around the table, I know, as the other companies, we are all working in finding the right metrics that are relevant to our business, because as mentioned by David, we are working in different sectors, and the different sectors also implies different rules, different metrics, or different ways of looking at the value chain. So in terms of greenwashing avoidance, policymakers for sure, if you have disclosure rules for a country or market access, then it's definitely support that. Voluntary initiatives, as we already shared, these should be trusted by consumer and citizen when they see that a company is striving, because as mentioned, I mean, we are not perfect and we cannot be perfect in one day. But when you see a company striving to follow these, then you should trust them versus a company that is completely under the shadow and just make, once every in a while claims and you cannot dig into that.
I know we're at time, but can I answer a couple of these? Yeah, I mean, so I think on greenwashing, building on what Stephanie said, just to give an example of, I think it's Business for Nature that was mentioned earlier, brought together various groups, TNFD and Business for Nature and many others, who collectively at Davos, some of you will have seen, came out with a really, really simple sort of approach, which I think is assess, commit, transform, and then alongside it is disclose. Disclose at every point, be transparent to the point that Stephanie's making, and when you are assessing and committing, do so with a science-based target type partner and these credible partners that are emerging, and then we can have a good basis for saying that's not greenwash. Is there going to be some greenwash hidden in there? Well, of course, but that's where radical transparency, or a new wave of more radical transparency, if you like, comes in, and that's the work. A lot of the work we've been doing is on that, like mapping supply chains. I mentioned trace finance before, which looks at supply chain risk, quantitative deforestation risk, maps finance into it, makes it all open so everyone can see it, and the conclusions from that study, they're really shocking. It debunks, all these ESG funds, and therefore they're no longer greenwashing because you can see it thanks to external transparency. So disclosure is incredibly important, but so is the new type of transparency coming through, and that's only going to continue happening. Of course, it is only going to continue happening. We need to accelerate it. So that's another. I'm full of positive notes on this panel. I have a couple of other thoughts, but I know we're at time, so. Oh, we have been given a bit more. I mean, just quickly on some of the previous points that were made. I mean, on advocacy that James was discussed. For me, these trillions or all these companies, it's not. I mean, it's definitely with these issues. It's not about when we talk about the GFANs or 130 trillion. It's not about divestment. It's about engagement. It's about active engagement, because we need transformation. And so we want to use the muscle and the power of big companies and these huge financial institutions to drive active engagement to force and push through change. And sure, then if there is not change, given all that transparency we talked about, let's move to divestment. So I think this advocacy side of things is incredibly important. It's really great to see groups like the IPDD, the Investor Policy Dialogue on Deforestation, go beyond engaging countries and start engaging the Brazilian Central Bank and the Brazilian Vice President. And so, there's absolutely a critical role there for engagement. And then finally, and I'll really try and keep this very short, but I was interested in particularly, the conversation we've had a bit about, impact and risk and then opportunity, and it is critical. The opportunity side is critical, but I think it's seeing it as the flip side of the same coin. The risk and opportunity. The opportunity arises out of managing the risk in part, or what's left when you manage the risk and you have to fill the gap. They are deeply, deeply interconnected, as you said, and I think should be seen as such. But I just wanted to nod to, or I was just really interested, Stephanie, in what you were saying, and you were just really bringing dependency and dependence to the table in this conversation in a really important way. And I think this is, understanding dependence on nature. You've got impacts, but understanding dependence is a sort of really good transit. Is talking of interesting. That's super interesting. If you're dependent on nature, you need to do something about it before it comes and pulls the rug from under your operations and your business. And just anecdotally, when the TNFD was looking at doing metrics work, there's been a scanning of 3,000 metrics from GRI and from everybody, and the vast majority are on impacts, and a tiny minority are on dependence on nature. And so, talking to a room of researchers and some of the best researchers in the world, this area of understanding dependence in more granular ways is just going to be so important for substantive reasons, but also for talking of motivation reasons. If you know that, Carbon Planet Tracker did a great report looking at soy yields, affected by deforestation in the same region in the Amazon, and so soy yields are down. So the hand that feeds you is by now biting you. We deforest for soy, and then the yields are going down. South of Brazil has water problems. Hydropower in Brazil, 70% of energy, ethanol for cars, water in the Amazon. Wow, that talk about dependence on nature hitting in deep economic terms, which is why the Brazilian Central Bank is much more active and alive to all these issues than the federal government, because it's a deep systemic risk. So I think, thanks, Stephanie, for raising that, because I think it's an incredibly important area.
Stéphanie, tu as la main levée?
I do. If I can make a comment and build on. Yeah, well, you're welcome, Niki, for the mention of dependencies. And just to bring something, also another aspect of dependencies on nature that you can also see as a consumer is that notion that all the storytelling about, your favorite product that you are finding in the shelves, your beauty product. I mean, every time you were saying, Keyvan, that you first focus on the specialties, because this is where you have a stronger impact, because this is your ingredients that you develop for your brand. So for sure, you have more leverage. And that's also something where you see the dependencies in the marketing and the storytelling. I just wanted to also, and kind of discussion mode with you, Niki, on that risk, because one aspect that I feel really brings a way to start a transformation within the company. From your question, if James was you, I think you shared the question about the difference between a privately owned versus a company in the stock exchange market. Actually, definitely we have other ways, other disclosure rules, and we can really play the game of being fully transparent as in the stock market, or you can play the game of very much being more secretive. We are in the middle. I'm not saying that we are sharing everything, but we do share quite a lot of information for a privately owned company. But then for me, to talk about climate and biodiversity, the main tipping point of where we were able to shift a bit the only short-term approach versus a medium-term, I didn't reach the long-term investment though, is when the climate and biodiversity has been integrated in the enterprise risk management. So that the board of directors realized that if they don't act upon climate and nature, their business might fall. And that was a small win because it's only, two key words in an enterprise risk management approach. It was so fundamental to change because now they are obliged to track that risk is mitigated. And therefore, then related to that notion of risk and opportunities, this risk management is and was already present in the way we are sourcing in every big companies like that. And when you talk about procurement, they do work with risk-based approach. Then they need to define what are the attributes that they want to keep and to, let's say, prioritize related to managing risk. So the main one is availability, okay? Because you need to deliver your product on the market. So you need to make sure that you have this in the shelves. But with time and thanks to that first step that was critical, even though tiny, now we have risk attributes around land conversion, ecosystem degradation, human rights, biodiversity loss as a whole. So we can better drive our responsible procurement actions and response so that you can really mitigate and then at some point of time of maturity, reach a transformation point. So just a few also illustrative points of how it can be done in the business.
Thank you. Thank you all. I do have to wrap up now, but it's just been a real pleasure to work with you all on this and to meet you. And sorry if I'm bossy sometimes. I think I will just simply hand over to Nat now, if she's here. She is here. So maybe I forgot to mention actually that nature-based insetting is a social venture spin-out of Nature-Based Solutions initiative that we set up a year ago to help companies implement nature-based solutions along their supply chain. So this is what we do.
So we're here at the end of the Nature-Based Solutions Conference 2022. So it now falls to us to briefly wrap up what has been a very intense, varied, exciting, and I really do hope ultimately quite productive 3 days. And when I say us, it's because this summary draws on the efforts of the whole Nature-Based Solutions team. So first I will outline, and I really do mean outline at quite a high level, the main take-homes of today's sessions, especially as there were parallel sessions. So I think I don't know about you, but I was suffering quite a bit of FOMO today, knowing there was all this exciting stuff going on in another place. So we'll do that briefly, and then I will provide a high-level overview of the key conference messages as we see them, and of the main emerging themes and what lies ahead for us as the Nature-Based Solutions community. So we started the day with a wonderful and really, really inspiring plenary by Ed Barbier. He very clearly outlined the economic failures of underpricing and underfunding of nature and the consequences of that. But he proposed a resolution, which is always good, that we phase out environmentally harmful subsidies, that we tax damaging activities, and that we use the vast amounts of revenue and savings from doing those things and invest that in the natural ecosystems and in our landscapes and seascapes on which we really, really do depend. He also highlighted the enormous funding gap that we face for nature recovery, protection, restoration, around $890 billion US. And he proposed measures, for example, a tropical carbon tax, saying that things like this can really help bridge the gap. This then sends signals to the market that nature has value and wider markets will follow, encouraging further forms of finance. But we need to ensure that that finance, when made available, gets to the people, gets to the communities and the projects that need it most, in the form that's most relevant to them. And we do that by asking the communities what the problems are that they're facing. We don't assume we know. what they're facing, and asking them what solutions they're trying, and build it up from there. So in session 7, so that was the first main multi-speaker session of the day, was on the economics of nature-based solutions. There was recognition that implementation of nature-based solutions basically requires a new economic paradigm, that this includes broad evaluation, tailored to local context, but based on robust science and robust economics that are fit for this century and fit for a rapidly changing world. We've got to be very clear about who's winning and who's losing, because there are always winners and losers. And we from implementing nature-based solutions versus, the winners and losers from the ongoing degradation of the natural world. There are examples from Cape Town showing how nature-based solutions can address critical problems very cost-effectively. The Indian context showed how agroecological nature-based solutions are key for sustainable production and can address many of the sustainable development goals in Southern Africa in general. And the Peru case studies illustrated the potential of nature-based solutions to provide multiple economic benefits, and in particular highlight the potential of ensuring a green recovery following a big shock like the pandemic we're still experiencing. Then we go into our parallel sessions. There was one here, nature-based solutions for sustainable food production, water security and resilience, that was here. We know that nature-based solutions such as agroforestry can be very good for food production and water security and quality, but we really do need to be aware of trade-offs. In fact, trade-offs was a very big theme, I think, across many sessions in this conference. We need very much a spatially explicit and temporally explicit approach to quantify, to really capture in a robust way the benefits and risks of nature-based solutions. And we must shift from intensive high-input practices to more regenerative practices. In a rapidly warming world where we don't know what's coming next, I would argue that is absolutely key. But we do need a lot of experimentation, learning from science, learning from practice to deploy that. But we need governance structures that enable collaboration and mobilizing funding at the required scale. So that links back to some of the comments Ed was making in his plenary. And we need much more research on the interactions between poverty, climate, and nature. And the final major point from this session was that there's a real role for diplomatic channels. For example, the FCDO of the UK government and its £3 billion of climate finance. How do we best deploy that? In session 8B, which was about scaling up nature-based solutions in the UK, particularly asking what is the role for government in supporting practitioners in making the right decisions so that we can have a flourishing landscape and build from the very degraded landscape in which we live in this part of the world. We need to think about multifunctional land use and definitely overcome a blinkered focus on a subset of outputs. So we need to think holistically. Again, that is a big theme from all the sessions. There are big information gaps to overcome, but there are already lots of strong case studies. So lots of communities and organisations and businesses all over the UK that are getting on, and farmers as well, and in particular, are getting on with implementing nature-based solutions because it's the right thing to do, even in the absence of any policy shift or any external inputs of finance. And that's very inspiring, and we need to share examples of what's working and also critically what's not working. Nature-based solutions are at the moment in the UK, as they are, I would say, in almost all countries of the world, insufficiently integrated into broader plans, and there is a lack of policy coherence. And I think those of you from other countries will agree that still governance and policy making is still extremely siloed, and we need to play a role in linking things up and having these cross-sectoral, cross-ministerial groups coordinating that. There is a huge potential for private finance. Interest in carbon biodiversity offsets is soaring in the UK, but standards are lacking, and there are perverse and unintended consequences of that we really need to tackle. Trees in the wrong places, for example. And government funding also remains key, but is insufficient. There is insufficient clarity over many of the emerging schemes, such as nature recovery networks and environmental land management schemes, and we'll see whether or not they will weather the storm. The final one of the last two final sessions, one that was held in here, really diverse mix of views and presenters. I was here for that one and really enjoyed it. There are high-quality carbon markets. They need to be improved, but they could direct investments to ensure greatest social and ecological benefits alongside those carbon benefits. In fact, it's clear, and businesses increasingly understanding, that we can't separate carbon from people, from biodiversity. We need these holistic approaches, holistic metrics. We have to engage with multiple stakeholders across sectors, develop partnerships over the entire supply chain, over the entire value chain. Really important. Greenwashing is a huge problem. We've talked about that a lot in this conference, and there was some great discussion about that in the previous session in particular. But we have, talked about it a lot in general. And we're not close to fixing this one yet, but we're all on it. We're going to get on with it in the weeks and months to come. But there are companies that are genuinely seeking sustainable transformation, and we need to work, as scientists and practitioners, work really closely with those sustainability teams. Greater transparency is, of course, required. There is growing consumer demand now, and that's just going to keep on building for businesses to report and reduce their impacts. But, as ever, we need the metrics in order to scale up good practice and also measure the outcomes for biodiversity, people and climate of the different interventions within supply chains, for example, through insetting. And finally, the session, again, apparently I wasn't there, so I have huge FOMO over missing this one, but there's a really, really fantastic discussion going over in the Oxford Martin School in parallel on mainstreaming nature-based solutions for urban sustainability. The huge concentration of people and economic capital in cities means that urban nature-based solutions are really important and can play, and there's growing evidence, quite solid evidence now, that integrating nature in cities can improve health and well-being, reduce poverty, providing we overcome issues such as green gentrification, and also plays an important role for adaptation and can play a role for mitigation, although more evidence on that is needed. We need long-term monitoring of outcomes, and ongoing maintenance is key and is often lacking, and I'd say that's not exclusive in the urban situation, and that's a general critique of nature-based solutions at the moment that we need to address. You know, there are traditions of urban nature-based solutions all over the world, in the global north as well as the global south, but engineered approaches are often the default. This is general factor in adaptation, and yet we know about the readability, scalability, affordability and effectiveness of using nature in combination where relevant with technological solutions, not an either nor. We need diversity. We need diversity of NbS methods, and this can facilitate community-based actions and developing partnerships. And I was really happy to hear that this was included in the session, the importance of storytelling, the importance of positive stories of change and how that can really encourage and enable the implementation of nature-based solutions. So though many and varied views have been expressed in our talks and in our posters and in our conversations, which is what we'd want given the interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary nature of this really wonderful audience, I do feel that there are at least some areas of consensus. So the enthusiasm for the interest in nature-based solutions is growing. It doesn't seem to be showing any signs of dimming, despite the very real concerns that there are amongst some members of the broader community, which we need to address. And varied stakeholders are really engaging with the concept now, and let's hope we can build that to increase the integrity of them. There is robust and growing evidence showing environmental, economic and social benefits of deploying nature-based solutions, though there needs to be more work on the scales, the temporal scales and the geographical scales over which these benefits can be delivered and for whom, critically, in the distribution of those. Nature-based solutions, I think many of us agree, that is a concept that's ready and useful at the multilateral policy level. We have now a UNEA-agreed definition. We have the global standard. We need to test and refine, but we have stuff there. So if we were to get nature-based solutions, those words in the decision text, for example, at COP26 or maybe COP28 of UNFCCC, will give parties oversight to ensure that high integrity both on the investment side and the project side. But we need to think about the big challenges to overcome. Equity is an essential consideration in the design, implementation, monitoring and evaluation of nature-based solutions throughout their lifetime. We need to recognise biophysical limits and potential trade-offs, and we have to, so going back to economics, move beyond narrow economic valuation to better reflect externalities and wider benefits. And the knowledge of indigenous peoples and local communities around the world and worldviews is key to fully recognise the value of nature-based solutions and to achieve fair and sustainable ones. So three things that stand out. Nature-based solutions need to be understood as ways of working with and as part of nature, and framed to ensure that multiple values of nature are respected. Whether in the urban context or in the rural context, nature-based solutions are place-based partnerships between people and nature and must start local with the communities. What problems are they facing? What solutions are they already implementing? How do they want to be supported? Next steps for the NbS community. Well, we've all got a lot of work to do. And we've all got our own, our own lists of things to do, which are longer than all of our arms put together for each of us, I think. But I think these are some key things. We need to really work on expanding participation. We need more diversity in those designing and implemented nature-based solutions, in particular Indigenous peoples and local community groups. We need to continue, so the science community and the practice community, we need to work together to build the evidence base for the value of nature-based solutions and for sharing best practice, but also sharing knowledge about what's not working as well. And that's often hard, but often incredibly valuable. So we need to get better at that, I think. There are these international frameworks and standards, multiple versions, all broadly converging on sort of key themes, but we need to test these, we need to refine these in the field, in the projects from the bottom up. We need to remain very critical. Some of us, and I'm guilty of this from time to time, we get very enthusiastic about nature-based solutions, but we have to remain critical. We have to remain vigilant to avoid greenwashing and so forth. We need to really call out projects that are not delivering for people and not delivering for biodiversity. And if in not doing so, they're not nature-based solutions, therefore. And we need to share our knowledge and visions as widely as possible and continue to build all the momentum for biodiversity-based, community-led, nature-based solutions informed by knowledge from science and practice. And you probably have another list of things that we need to do, but I think those are the things that me and my team have drawn out from the discussions across the next 3 days, but happy to discuss. Okay, so one thing we really need to do is speed up the delivery of high-quality research into policy and practice. Not only do the interdisciplinary research itself, but ensure that that research is tackling critical policy-relevant questions and that it gets to the people that need it most when they need it. So the medical science community rapidly rose to the challenge of COVID-19. Now the natural and social sciences community, the economists, practitioners, and so forth, we have to do the same to address ecological, climate, and the equity crisis we face. To this end, I just want to briefly draw your attention to the Agile initiative that we have recently established here in Oxford University. Do please visit the website and get in touch if you'd like to be involved in this. And the other last sort of mini plug that I wanted to make is that to highlight that we also need to educate and empower both current and future leaders in the ever-evolving science, policy, practice and business of nature-based solutions. So this year we're launching our Nature-Based Solutions Foundation course. Do visit our website or just get in touch if you'd like to take part in that. It's going to be an opportunity to go even deeper into some of the critical issues that we've covered at this conference. So to wrap up, let me conclude. We've seen, and we've discussed, and the science is very clear on this, that nature-based solutions can make a critical contribution to reaching net zero carbon emissions this century, but only if combined with dramatic cuts in greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors of the economy. We're all really clear on that. But this is not an argument against scaling up nature-based solutions. Instead, it underscores the need to consider the many well-evidenced benefits of implementing them, perhaps especially their critical role in supporting local livelihoods and social and ecological adaptation to climate change. Achieving net zero carbon emissions, transitioning to a nature-based positive economy will also require a systemic change in the way we behave as societies, shifting to a dominant worldview that is based on valuing the quality of life and human well-being rather than material wealth, and connection with nature rather than that it's conquest. There are signs that this shift is taking place, the rise in activism, for example, but nature-based solutions, if carefully designed and implemented, I think can help accelerate this transition to where we are now to where we need to be. And now for the fun part, I would like, before I let you go, and I realize many of you have long journeys ahead, so thank you for your patience. I do have some big, big thank yous to make. First of all, I want to thank the Natural History Museum staff, team, the team here, amazing team here, for their support and for letting us use this extraordinary space. I've had many of you have enjoyed being here. It really is a spectacular place to be based, especially for those of us interested in biodiversity, climate change, and so forth. And thanks also to the Oxford Martin School, where we were able to run those sessions in parallel. I want to also thank the amazing caterers for all the delicious, entirely plant-based food that we've been enjoying this weekend. I want to thank Steve at the Film Shed for so successfully delivering a very complex hybrid event and for his patience with all the very, very busy... all of the speakers are, they're busy saving the planet, so they tend not to get their video messages and their PowerPoint presentations ready until seconds before we need them, and having to deal with that in the context of delivering it to a Zoom audience and keeping you all on Zoom happy has been very challenging. So thank you very much, Steve and team. You've been brilliant. I want to thank a massive, massive thank you, of course, to our sponsors for your incredibly generous support of this event, in particular to Reckitt. As a result of your support, we have been able to bring many, many different and diverse voices to this conference from around the world, which has been really important. So thank you very much for that support. And of course, thank you to you, our wonderful speakers, our chairs, our audience in person and online, all our poster presenters and so forth. I do hope that all of you have managed to see some of the posters. There's lots of important work there. And thank you to our Zoom audience. It's numbered around 650. They didn't all tune in at once, but that many of them tuned in at different times at various stages of the week. So thank you for that. And thank you, Zoom community, for being patient with our slightly shifting, ever-shifting timetable throughout the week. So it's my sincere hope that after 3 days that you will all emerge, we've all emerged at the very least a bit more enriched and emboldened with at least new colleagues and friends. I certainly feel that I have. And then ideally we'll also have some concrete plans on how best to work together to continue to build momentum for best practice nature-based solutions. But most importantly, and finally, I really want to thank my amazing team in the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, who have worked so flexibly with humour and patience and diligence, with very little sleep, to ensure a very smoothly running event. And thank you for your tweeting, making notes, taking photographs. Juliet Turner, thank you for all the beautiful photographs, and the many, many other things, and dealing with many other things that have been going on over the last few days, including stuff I don't know about and don't want to know about and need to know about it. I really am very, very proud of you all. I want to thank, I want to thank my brother, Dan, who is the creator of all our beautiful websites, web platforms, logos, banners and flyers, all these beautiful images and things you see around. That's him. Thank you. I'm only sorry that due to illness you were unable to join us, but you are here in spirit. Now, I want to express my particular gratitude to Audrey and Georgia, Audrey Wagner and Georgia Hall. Are they here? They should be here. Thank you. You've worked incredibly hard, tirelessly, full-time on this for 6 months. And without you, none of this would have happened. So I'd like to give you both something to say thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great. And then if the rest of the team can come up onto the stage as well, and we can give them all a big clap too. So can you all come up, please? You better be here. Brilliant. Yeah. Yeah. I'll take a picture and then we can come up. Take it. Well, there's more of us than I realised.
Okay, and I'd like to give a huge thank you to Nathalie Seddon, of course. Let's all give her a huge round of applause.
So I love what we're creating here. I love this community. I love our vision and our resolve. And I hope it will continue to grow until we don't need it anymore, because we're already doing the right thing, working with nature as part of nature, because it's us, it's our home, and it's our life support system. So good luck, everyone, and see you next time.